The bitter winds of the Norwegian fjords carried death that winter, and Ragnar Ironwolf could smell it in the air as he rode through the abandoned settlement. Bodies lay frozen in doorways, victims of the endless famine that had gripped the northlands for 3 brutal seasons. But then he heard it, the soft whimper of a child, barely audible above the howling gale. Behind a collapsed wooden hut, he found her. A young mother clutched 2 skeletal children to her chest, her own frame nothing but bones wrapped in tattered furs. Her eyes held the hollow stare of someone who had already accepted death. Most jarls would have ridden past. Most would have seen 3 more corpses waiting to happen. But Ragnar wasn't most jarls. Beneath his fearsome reputation as a ruthless warrior lay a secret that could shatter his iron rule, a past that made him see himself in every starving child, every desperate parent. As he dismounted and approached the dying family, he made a decision that would change the fate of his entire kingdom. The question that would haunt him was saving them an act of mercy, or had he just doomed them all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The woman's eyes tracked his movement with the wary desperation of a cornered animal. She pulled her children closer, as if her frail arms could somehow shield them from whatever fresh horror approached. Ragnar had seen that look before, in his own mother's face 30 years past, when the raiders came to their settlement and left nothing but ash and sorrow. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice cracking like ice. "They're just children." Ragnar stopped 3 paces away, his massive frame casting a shadow over the huddled family. The wind whipped his dark cloak around him, and for a moment he must have looked like death himself. The irony wasn't lost on him. Ragnar Ironwolf, the scourge of the northern seas, the man whose very name sent raiders fleeing, standing before a woman who probably weighed less than his battle-axe. "When did you last eat?" he asked, his voice gentler than the storm around them. The question seemed to confuse her. She blinked slowly, as if struggling to process words that weren't threats or commands. The children had the last of our grain 4 days ago, maybe 5. Time," she trailed off, shaking her head. The smaller child, a girl no more than 5 winters old, lifted her head from her mother's chest. Her eyes were too large in her gaunt face, but they held a spark that the famine hadn't yet extinguished. The boy, perhaps 8, remained motionless, and Ragnar felt his jaw tighten as he recognized the signs. The child was close to the final darkness. "Stand up," Ragnar commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded longships and won battles. "You're coming with me." The woman stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign tongue. "I don't understand." "My haul is half a day's ride. There's food, warmth, shelter." He gestured toward his horse, a massive stallion bred for war but steady enough to carry passengers. "My horse can bear you all. Why?" The word escaped her lips like a prayer, laden with suspicion and desperate hope in equal measure. Ragnar crouched down, bringing himself to her eye level. This close, he could see the delicate bone structure beneath her sunken cheeks, the evidence of what she must have been before the famine carved away everything but her will to protect her children. "Because someone should have done the same for my mother, long ago." The admission hung in the frozen air between them. Ragnar had never spoken those words aloud, not to his warriors, not to his advisors, not even to himself in the dark hours before dawn. His origin story was well-crafted mythology, the bastard son of a jarl raised by wolves, forged in battle. The truth was far less impressive, a starving peasant child who had clawed his way to power through cunning, brutality, and an iron determination never to be helpless again. "I can't repay you," the woman said, struggling to sit straighter. "I have nothing left to offer. I'm not asking for payment." Ragnar stood and extended his hand. "I'm asking you to trust me long enough to save your children's lives." The woman looked at his outstretched hand, scarred, powerful, stained with the blood of countless enemies. Then she looked at her children, at the boy whose breathing had grown shallow, at the girl who watched the exchange with curious eyes that held too much understanding for her age. "What's your name?" Ragnar asked softly. "Astrid," she whispered. "My son is Eric. My daughter is Freya." "Astrid." He kept his hand extended. "I am Ragnar Ironwolf, and I give you my oath, no harm will come to you or your children under my protection." The moment stretched between them, heavy with the weight of decision. Around them, the wind continued its mournful song through the bones of the dead settlement, but in this small space behind a ruined hut, the future balanced on the edge of a woman's choice. The woman's eyes fluttered open as warmth seeped back into her limbs. She found herself wrapped in thick furs beside a crackling fire, the acrid smoke mixing with the scent of cooking meat. For a moment, she thought she had crossed into the realm of the dead, but the dull ache in her frost-bitten fingers reminded her she still drew breath in Midgard. "You wake." The voice was deep, commanding, yet held an unexpected gentleness. She turned her head to see the giant of a man crouched beside the fire, turning a rabbit on a makeshift spit. His blonde beard caught the firelight like spun gold, and intricate tattoos spiraled up his muscular forearms. "Your children sleep safely. They will live." Memory crashed back like a cold wave, the failed harvest, her husband's death from the wasting sickness, the desperate flight from their village as winter's grip tightened around them like a wolf's jaws. She struggled to sit, her voice barely a whisper. Who are you?" "I am Bjorn Ironside, Jarl of the northern reaches." He pulled the rabbit from the fire and began tearing off strips of meat with practiced efficiency. "And you are far from any settlement, woman. What drives a mother to lead her children into the frozen death?" She accepted the warm meat with trembling hands, fighting back tears of gratitude. "I am Astrid, daughter of Harald the Wheelwright. Our village..." There was nothing left. The grain stores rotted, the livestock died. When the tax collectors came demanding tribute for your cousin Ragnar's war, they took what little remained. She paused, studying his face for signs of anger at her implied criticism. I thought perhaps we could reach my sister's settlement beyond the mountains." Bjorn's jaw tightened at the mention of his cousin. Ragnar's ambitions had grown like a cancer, demanding ever more resources for his dreams of conquest across the western seas. "Ragnar's appetite for gold blinds him to the suffering of our people," he said, surprising her with his candor. "But crossing the frost-backed mountains with children in winter, that is certain death. Better to die trying to reach safety than starve slowly in the ruins of our home." Astrid's voice carried a fierce pride that made Bjorn regard her with new respect. "My children deserved a chance." A small whimper drew their attention to where the two children slept bundled in furs. The younger one, a girl of perhaps 5 winters, stirred restlessly. Her brother, barely older, instinctively pulled her closer in his sleep, even in his unconscious state acting as her protector. "They have their mother's strength," Bjorn observed, rising to check on them. His massive frame moved with surprising grace as he knelt beside the sleeping forms, adjusting their coverings with gentle hands that seemed too large for such tender care. "What are their names?" "Freydis and Eric," Astrid replied, watching this fearsome warrior tend to her children with the care of a mother. "They are all I have left in this world." Bjorn nodded slowly, his mind working through possibilities. His own hall stood 3 days' ride to the north, warm and well-provisioned. He could easily spare food and shelter for the winter, but taking in refugees was not a decision made lightly. His people already struggled under the burden of Ragnar's demands for tribute and fighting men. "The storm passes, but another will follow soon," he said, returning to the fire. "These mountains show no mercy to the unprepared. Your sister's settlement, how far beyond the eastern pass?" "A day's journey, perhaps 2. Hope flickered in Astrid's eyes. You would help us reach it?" Bjorn was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. His father had taught him that a jarl's first duty was to his people, but what defined his people? Those who lived within his borders, those who swore oaths of fealty, or was it something broader, all who suffered under the harsh rule of winter and the harsher rule of ambitious men? "I know this settlement you speak of," he said finally. "It was raided by sea-wolves from the eastern kingdoms 2 months past. Your sister—" He saw understanding dawn in Astrid's face and let his silence speak the rest. The fire popped and crackled in the sudden quiet. Astrid's shoulders sagged as her last hope crumbled like sand. She had led her children into the wilderness for nothing. They had no destination, no refuge waiting beyond the mountains. "Then we are truly lost," she whispered. Bjorn studied this woman who had sacrificed everything for her children's slim chance at survival. In her hollow cheeks and determined eyes, he saw something that Ragnar's gold lust had blinded him to. The true strength of their people lay not in conquest, but in their willingness to endure, to protect what mattered most. "No," he said firmly, his decision crystallizing like ice forming on still water. "You will come north with me." The great hall of Eriksholm buzzed with tension, as thick as the smoke rising from the central fire pit. Jarl Erik Ironwolf sat upon his carved oak throne, his weathered hands gripping the armrests as he surveyed the assembled warriors and advisors. 3 days had passed since he brought the starving family within his walls, and already the whispers had grown into open dissent. "You risk everything we've built for strangers," growled Bjorn Bloodaxe, his most trusted war chief. The massive warrior's scarred face twisted with disapproval as he stepped forward. "These people could be spies, sent by our enemies to weaken us from within." Eric's steel-grey eyes never wavered from Bjorn's face. A woman barely alive and children who could not lift a sword between them? What intelligence could they possibly gather that would threaten us? "It is not what they might learn," interjected Astrid the Wise, the settlement's eldest advisor. Her silver braids caught the firelight as she leaned heavily on her walking staff. "It is what others will think when word spreads. You show mercy to outlanders, while our own stores dwindle with each passing day of winter." The hall erupted in murmurs of agreement. Eric felt the weight of their stares, the judgment of men who had followed him through countless battles and trusted his decisions with their lives. Yet something deep within him refused to yield. The image of the woman's hollow eyes and her children's sunken cheeks haunted him, more persistent than any battlefield memory. "Speak freely," Eric commanded, his voice cutting through the noise. "Let every man voice his concerns." Young Olaf the Bold, barely past his first raid, stepped forward with the reckless courage of youth. "Jarl, my father always said that strength shown to enemies is weakness. If we cannot feed our own through the winter, how can we share our bread with strangers?" "And what happens," countered Eric, rising slowly from his throne, "when spring comes and these people remember who showed them kindness in their darkest hour? What allies might we gain? What debts of honor might be owed?" Bjorn spat into the fire, causing it to hiss. "Pretty words, my lord, but dead men collect no debts. The stores will not last if we feed every hungry mouth that wanders into our territory." "Then perhaps," said a new voice from the shadows near the hall's entrance, "you should hear what those hungry mouths have to say." All eyes turned to see Ingrid, the woman Eric had rescued, standing at the threshold. 3 days of warmth and food had already begun to restore some life to her features, though she remained gaunt and pale. Her dark hair, now clean and braided, framed a face that spoke of nobility despite her ragged circumstances. Behind her lingered her 2 children, the boy Harold clutching his sister Runa's hand. "I did not ask to speak," Ingrid continued, walking slowly into the hall despite the hostile stares. "But I will not have mercy repaid with silence when that mercy is questioned." Eric held up a hand to quiet the angry murmurs. Something in the woman's bearing commanded attention. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard, to being obeyed. "You wonder who we are," Ingrid said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "You fear we bring danger to your hearth. I am Ingrid Ravensborn, daughter of Jarl Magnus of the northern reaches. My father's hall lies in ashes, his warriors scattered or dead. An army comes from the eastern fjords, led by a man who calls himself the Wolf of Storms. He takes what he wants and burns what he cannot claim. The hall fell silent except for the crackling of flames. Eric felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind rattling the shutters. "How many ships?" Bjorn asked, his earlier hostility replaced by professional interest. 40 longships. When they struck our shores, Harold spoke for the first time, his young voice steady despite his fear. Maybe more by now. They gather thralls and warriors as they move south. Astrid leaned forward on her staff. "South, you say, following the coast?" Ingrid nodded grimly. "Eriksholm lies directly in their path. My children and I fled through the mountain passes to bring warning. We are not refugees seeking charity, Lord Eric. We are the remnants of your neighbor's kingdom, come to offer alliance in the face of a threat that will devour us all if we stand alone." Eric studied the woman's face, seeing now what he had missed in the blizzard. The calloused hands of someone familiar with weapons, the straight bearing of nobility, the fierce intelligence in eyes he had mistaken for mere desperation. His act of mercy had brought him more than starving strangers. It had delivered a war council. "How long do we have?" he asked quietly. "The passes will clear with the spring thaw," Ingrid replied. 2 months, perhaps 3 if the winter holds. Eric looked around his hall, meeting each man's gaze in turn. The discussion about feeding refugees had just become a question of survival. The longhouse felt different, with new voices echoing through its timber halls. Bjorn watched from his seat at the high table as Astrid moved through the great room with quiet efficiency, tending to the hearth while her children sat nearby, still wide-eyed at their surroundings. 3 days had passed since he'd brought them from the forest, and already the household had begun to shift around their presence, like a river finding new channels. "The boy has strong hands," Olaf observed, settling his weathered frame beside Bjorn. The old warrior's eyes followed young Eric, who was carefully stacking split wood under the watchful eye of Tormund. Quick to learn, quicker to listen. Bjorn grunted his agreement, though his gaze lingered on Astrid rather than her son. She moved with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to hardship, wasting no motion, speaking little. Yet he'd noticed how the other women had begun to seek her counsel about small matters, the best way to preserve fish, how to ease a crying child. There was something about her that drew trust like iron drew lightning. "The men are talking," Olaf continued, his voice dropping low. "Some wonder why you brought strangers into our midst when winter stores already run thin. Let them wonder." Bjorn's tone carried the weight of finality, but Olaf pressed on. "Harold Ironside's raids grow bolder. Word came this morning. He struck at Gunnar's settlement 2 days north, burned half the village, took the rest as thralls. The old warrior's scarred hands clenched around his drinking horn. Our enemies multiply while we take in strays." The criticism stung because it echoed Bjorn's own doubts. Every decision a Jarl made rippled outward like stones cast in still water, and he couldn't yet see where these particular ripples might lead. But when he'd looked into that snow-filled hollow and seen death creeping toward 3 innocent lives, the choice had felt as natural as breathing. A commotion near the entrance drew his attention. Magnus burst through the heavy doors, snow still clinging to his cloak, his face flushed from hard riding. The young warrior's eyes swept the hall until they found Bjorn. Then he strode forward with urgent purpose. "Jarl," Magnus said, dropping to one knee. "Ships on the horizon, 3 long ships flying Harold's banner, moving south along the coast." Bjorn rose slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the hall upon him. "How far?" "Half a day's sail, maybe less if the wind holds." Magnus's voice carried barely controlled tension. "Thorvald thinks they're scouting our defenses." The hall had fallen silent except for the crackling of flames. Even the children had stopped their quiet play, sensing the shift in mood. Bjorn's mind raced through possibilities. Harold testing their strength, seeking safe harbor, or perhaps hunting for something specific. The timing felt too convenient to be mere coincidence. "Double the watch on the harbour," Bjorn commanded. "Send word to the outlying farms. Anyone who wishes shelter is welcome within our walls. And Magnus—" He paused, ensuring his next words carried clearly through the hall. "Ready the longships. If Harold wants to dance, we'll give him a partner." As the warriors dispersed to their tasks, Bjorn noticed Astrid had moved closer. Her youngest daughter clutched protectively against her chest. Her face had gone pale at Magnus's news, and he realized she must recognize Harold's name. Most folk in these lands knew his reputation for brutality. "You have nothing to fear," he told her quietly. "These walls have stood against worse storms than Harold Ironside." She nodded, but he could see the fear hadn't left her eyes. "My lord," she said hesitantly, "if there's to be fighting, perhaps it would be better if we found shelter elsewhere. I would not have you think we bring misfortune." The suggestion surprised him. Most would cling to the protection of his hall, yet she was offering to leave. It spoke to a strength of character that reminded him why he'd made his choice in the forest. "You'll stay," he said firmly. "Whatever comes, you're under my protection now." Before she could respond, young Eric appeared at her side, his face set with determination beyond his years. "Jarl Bjorn," the boy said, his voice steady despite his youth. "If fighting comes, I can help. I'm not afraid." Bjorn studied the child, perhaps 10 winters old, thin from hunger but with steel in his spine. It would be easy to dismiss such an offer, to send him away with gentle words. Instead, he found himself seeing something familiar in the boy's eyes, an echo of his own determination when he'd first picked up a sword. "Can you follow orders without question?" he asked seriously. "Yes, my lord." "Then you'll help Tormund with the weapons. Keep the blades sharp and the shields ready." He placed a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. "Every warrior needs someone he can trust to watch his back." Eric's smile could have lit the entire hall. Outside, the wind began to howl. The great hall of Ironhold buzzed with tension as thick as the smoke from the central hearth. Eric sat in his carved wooden throne, its arms worn smooth by generations of jarls before him, while his advisors arranged themselves in a semicircle before him. The morning light filtered through the narrow windows, casting long shadows across the stone floor where Astrid and her children had knelt just 3 days prior. "You've brought shame upon us all," growled Bjorn Ironbeard, his weathered face twisted with disgust. The old warrior's hand rested on the pommel of his sword as he spoke, a gesture not lost on anyone present. "Taking in Saxon refugees like some Christian monk. The men are beginning to whisper." Eric's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "And what exactly are they whispering, old friend?" "That our Jarl has grown soft," spat Gunnar the Red, stepping forward with the swagger that had made him both feared and respected in equal measure. "That the blood of wolves has thinned to that of sheep. Harold Bluetooth's emissaries arrived at dawn, Eric. They've heard talk of your charity." The words hit like hammer blows, each one calculated to sting. Eric had expected this confrontation, had prepared for it during sleepless nights since bringing Astrid's family within his walls. Yet hearing his own warriors question his strength still felt like swallowing broken glass. "Harold's spies are everywhere," continued Thorvald the Wise, though his tone carried less venom than the others. "If he believes weakness has taken root in Ironhold, he'll move against us before the spring thaw. We cannot afford to appear vulnerable." Through the wooden partition that separated the main hall from the sleeping quarters, Eirik could hear the soft murmur of Astrid's voice as she tended to her children. Young Magnus had taken fever during the night, and she'd been singing old Saxon lullabies to calm him. The sound seemed to drift through the very stones, a gentle counterpoint to the harsh words being spoken mere feet away. "Vulnerable?" Eirik rose slowly from his throne, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the nearest advisors. "Tell me, Gunnar, when did showing mercy to starving children become a sign of weakness? When did we become the kind of men who measure our strength by how many innocents we can turn away to die?" Gunnar's hand moved to his axe, though he made no move to draw it. Since those children carry Saxon blood, since that woman speaks the tongue of our enemies, you've brought vipers into our nest, Jarl, and given them our warmth to survive the winter. Enough. Eric's voice boomed through the hall, silencing even the crackling of the fire. I've heard your concerns, and I understand your fears, but I will not cast out a mother and her children to satisfy Harald's spies or soothe your wounded pride. Bjorn stepped closer, his grey beard bristling with indignation. Then you doom us all. Harald has been seeking an excuse to move against the northern holds. He'll use this as proof that you've lost your edge, that Ironhold can be taken without significant loss. Let him come. The words escaped Eric's lips before he could fully consider their weight. The hall fell silent save for the distant sound of wind howling through the mountain passes. If Harald Bluetooth believes that compassion makes a man weak, then he's forgotten what it truly means to be strong. Thorvald's eyes widened. You would risk everything for strangers? I would risk everything for what's right. Eric moved to the great window that overlooked the valley below, where his people worked to prepare for the harsh winter months ahead. Look at them, all of you. Our farmers, our craftsmen, our fighters. They follow us not because we're the cruelest or the most ruthless, but because we protect what matters, because we stand between them and the darkness. He turned back to face his advisors, noting how several of them had stepped back from his presence. If we become the kind of men who sacrifice the innocent for political convenience, then we've already lost everything worth protecting. Harald can have my head before he can have my honor. Gunnar shook his head in disgust. Pretty words won't stop his army when it comes marching through these passes. No, Eirik agreed, settling back into his throne with a finality that echoed through the stone chamber. But they'll ensure that whatever comes, we face it as men worthy of the legacy we've inherited. Now, unless any of you have forgotten your oaths of loyalty, I suggest you begin preparing our defenses instead of debating my choices. One by one, his advisors filed out, their footsteps heavy with resignation and unspoken fears. Only the whisper of Astrid's lullabies remained, weaving through the silence like a promise of something worth fighting for. The great hall of Bjornstead buzzed with nervous energy as warriors gathered around the long tables, their voices echoing off the carved wooden beams. Torches flickered against the walls, casting dancing shadows over the assembled men who had answered Jarl Bjorn's call to council. Outside, snow continued to fall, muffling the sounds of the settlement and adding to the sense of isolation that had settled over them like a burial shroud. Astrid stood at the edge of the hall, her children pressed close to her sides. 3 days had passed since Bjorn had brought them to safety, and already she could see the changes in young Einar and little Freydis. Colour had returned to their cheeks, and their eyes no longer held that hollow, desperate look of the starving. Yet as she watched the warriors debate, she felt a familiar knot of fear forming in her stomach. The raids grow bolder, declared Eric Ironhand, one of Bjorn's most trusted captains. His scarred face was grim as he addressed the assembly. They struck the Thornwick farms just 2 days past, killed 6 men, burned the grain stores and made off with livestock we can ill afford to lose. Murmurs of anger rippled through the hall. Bjorn sat in his high seat, carved with the likeness of ravens and wolves, his fingers drumming against the armrest as he listened. His blue eyes were thoughtful, calculating, and Astrid found herself studying the man who had saved her family. There was something different about him from other Jarls she had known, a quality that made his warriors follow him not just out of fear, but out of genuine loyalty. "What of the southern approach?" Bjorn asked, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Any word from the scouts?" A young warrior named Olaf stepped forward, his face flushed with cold. "Ice blocks the fjord completely, my lord. Nothing larger than a fishing boat could make passage, and even then it would be treacherous. We're cut off until the spring thaw." "Which gives Grim Bloodaxe exactly what he wants," spat another warrior. "Time to pick us apart, piece by piece, while we're trapped like foxes in a den." The mention of that name sent a chill through Astrid that had nothing to do with the winter cold. Grim Bloodaxe. She had heard stories of the rival Jarl even in her remote mountain village, a man who ruled through terror and had been steadily expanding his territory, consuming smaller settlements like a hungry wolf. Bjorn rose from his seat, and the hall fell silent. Even in the flickering torchlight, his presence commanded attention. "Grim thinks the winter makes us weak," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "He believes that cold and hunger will break our spirit before he needs to face us in open battle." "Perhaps he's right to think so," muttered Thorvald, an older warrior with silver in his beard. "Our food stores run low, and with each raid, we lose more of what we need to survive until spring. How long before our own people begin to look elsewhere for protection?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the torches. Astrid saw several warriors shift uncomfortably, and she realized that this was the heart of their fear, not just death in battle, but the slow dissolution of everything they had built. Bjorn's gaze swept over the assembled men, and for a moment his eyes met Astrid's across the hall. She saw something there, a flicker of recognition, as if her presence reminded him of something important. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new conviction. "3 days ago I found a mother and her children dying in the snow," he said, and Astrid felt every eye in the hall turn toward her. They had lost everything to raiders, their home, their husband and father, their hope. It would have been easy to ride past, to tell myself that one family's survival was not my concern when we faced such threats. He paused, letting his words sink in. But in that moment, I remembered why we fight. Not for glory, not for gold, but for the right of our people to live without fear, to raise their children in safety, to show mercy when mercy is needed. Astrid felt tears prick her eyes as she understood what he was doing. By acknowledging her publicly, by making her family's story part of their story, he was reminding his warriors of their purpose. "Grim Bloodaxe believes that winter makes us weak," Bjorn continued, his voice rising. "But he is wrong. Winter tests us, forges us, shows us what truly matters. We do not merely survive the cold, we use it. We know these mountains, these forests, these hidden paths that summer raiders cannot find." Eric Ironhand stood, his scarred face splitting into a fierce grin. "What would you have us do, my lord?" Bjorn's answer came without hesitation. "We take the fight to them. Before the next full moon, we strike at Grim's weakness, his arrogance. He thinks us trapped and helpless. We'll show him the error of that assumption." The hall erupted in war cries that shook the rafters, and Astrid pulled her children closer, knowing that their fate was now bound to whatever came next. The great hall fell silent as Astrid's boots echoed against the stone floor. Every conversation died, every cup paused halfway to lips, every eye turned toward the woman who had emerged from 3 days of fevered sleep. She moved with purpose despite her obvious weakness, her chin raised in defiance of the whispers that followed her wake. Bjorn looked up from his seat at the high table where he'd been discussing trade routes with his advisors. The sight of her stopped his words mid-sentence. Gone was the broken creature he'd pulled from the snow. In her place stood someone transformed, not yet the warrior she might become, but no longer the victim she had been. "I would speak with you, Jarl," Astrid said, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space. "Alone." Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd. Women did not make demands of jarls, especially not foreign women with no standing, no family ties, no value beyond what mercy had granted them. Several of Bjorn's men shifted uncomfortably, hands drifting towards sword hilts at what they perceived as an insult to their lord's honor. Bjorn raised a hand, silencing the room. He studied Astrid's face, seeing something there that intrigued him more than it offended. "Walk with me," he said simply, rising from his chair. They stepped out into the crisp morning air, their breath forming clouds in the bitter cold. Snow crunched beneath their feet as they made their way toward the practice yards, where the ring of steel on steel provided a steady rhythm. Neither spoke until they were well away from curious ears. "You saved my life," Astrid began, then quickly held up a hand as Bjorn started to respond. Let me finish. You saved my children's lives. That creates a debt I cannot ignore, but it also creates a problem. Bjorn's eyebrows rose slightly. In all his years, no one had ever called his mercy a problem. Explain. I am not your people. I will never be your people. Every day I remain here under your protection, I am a reminder that you chose compassion over practical wisdom. She gestured toward the hall they'd left behind. Your warriors already question it. I can see it in their faces, hear it in their whispered conversations when they think I cannot understand their tongue. You speak our language well for a foreigner, Bjorn observed, neither confirming nor denying her assessment. My grandmother was from these lands, taken in a raid 50 years past. She taught me your words, your ways before she died. Astrid's voice carried a weight of old grief. I know enough to recognize when a decision made in kindness threatens to become a weakness in the eyes of those who must follow you into battle. They had reached the edge of the practice yard. Young warriors sparred with wooden weapons, while seasoned fighters offered gruff corrections and occasional praise. The scene of preparation and discipline reminded both watchers of the realities they faced. What would you have me do? Bjorn asked. Cast you out? Let you and your children freeze as I should have done days ago? There was no mockery in his tone, only genuine curiosity about where her thoughts led. Give me a way to earn our place here, not as refugees dependent on your charity, but as people who contribute to your strength. Astrid turned to face him fully. I can fight. My father ensured I knew weapons before he taught me weaving. I can hunt, track, survive in conditions that would kill softer folk. My son Eric, though young, has quick hands and a quicker mind. My daughter Sigrid sees things others miss, and what of those who say a woman's place is not on the warrior's path? Astrid's laugh held no humor. Those who say such things have never watched their world burn, while the men who should have protected it lay dead in the snow. I learned that a woman's place is wherever she must be to keep her children breathing. Bjorn considered this, watching as one of his younger warriors took a particularly hard blow and staggered backward. The boy, barely 16, shook off the strike and immediately moved to attack again. Resilience, Bjorn knew, came in many forms. The spring raids begin in 2 months, he said finally. We scout southward, testing the defenses of kingdoms grown fat and lazy during the winter. Dangerous work, but necessary if we're to survive another year. I would join those scouts. You would risk leaving your children orphaned so soon after nearly losing them. I would risk anything to ensure they have a future worth living. Astrid's eyes held a fierce determination. They cannot grow strong in a hall where their mother is seen as a burden. Better they see me earn respect through deed than inherit shame through charity. Bjorn nodded slowly, understanding more than she perhaps realized. Leadership, he had learned long ago, often meant making choices that others would call madness. Sometimes mercy required courage, and courage demanded unexpected forms. We begin training tomorrow at dawn, he said. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants as Astrid made her way through the settlement. 3 weeks had passed since Ragnar brought them to his halls, and already the rhythm of daily life here felt more familiar than the desperate wandering that had consumed the months before. Her children had color in their cheeks again, and Bjorn had grown bold enough to shadow the Jarl's warriors during their morning drills. She paused at the great hall's entrance, balancing the wooden bucket of fresh milk against her hip. Inside, she could hear heated voices rising above the crackle of the hearth fire. The tone made her hesitate. This was not the usual morning banter of men breaking their fast. The raids grow bolder, came the gravelly voice of Sven, Ragnar's most trusted advisor. They struck 3 farms along the eastern border last night. Livestock stolen, grain stores burned. They left their mark carved into the barn doors. Astrid pressed herself closer to the doorway, not quite entering but unable to resist listening. The mark Sven spoke of, she knew it well. A twisted serpent consuming its own tail, the symbol that had haunted her nightmares since the night her husband died, defending their home. Jarek grows restless, another voice added. His scouts probe our defenses daily. He knows we're spread thin with the winter patrols. Ragnar's response was measured, but edged with steel. Let him probe. Every day he delays his main assault is another day our people prepare, another day our stores grow stronger. And another day his forces swell, Sven countered. Word spreads that he offers rich rewards to any who join his banner. Desperate men make dangerous allies, but they make allies nonetheless. Astrid felt the familiar chill of fear creep up her spine. Jarl the Ruthless. The name alone was enough to silence children and send women clutching their amulets. He had carved a bloody path across 3 kingdoms, leaving nothing but ash and sorrow in his wake. That Ragnar's lands stood in his way seemed as inevitable as the coming of winter. She stepped into the hall, her presence immediately noticed by the gathered men. Their conversation died as surely as if she had doused the fire with ice water. "Forgive me," she said, setting down the bucket with deliberate care. "I brought fresh milk from the goats." Ragnar studied her face, and she knew he could read the recognition there. "You know of what we speak." It was not a question. Astrid nodded slowly, her hands smoothing the worn fabric of her dress, a nervous habit that betrayed her calm exterior. "Jarl's raiders killed my husband," she said simply. "Burned our farm. We fled in the night with nothing but what we could carry." The words came easier now than they had weeks ago, the sharp edges of grief worn smooth by repetition and time. The warriors exchanged glances, and she caught the mixture of pity and calculation in their eyes. To them, she was both a reminder of what they fought to protect and evidence of what would come if they failed. "What can you tell us of his methods?" Ragnar asked, leaning forward in his carved chair. "Every detail might save lives." Astrid closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember what she had tried so hard to forget. "He strikes at dawn, when the defenders are tired from night watches. His men are disciplined. They don't break ranks to loot until the fighting is done. He uses fear as a weapon, leaving survivors to spread tales of his cruelty." "How many men?" Sven pressed. 24 when they came for us, but that was just one raiding party. My husband spoke with other survivors before." She let the sentence hang unfinished. "They said Jarl's main force numbered in the hundreds." The hall fell silent except for the pop and hiss of burning wood. Astrid could see the weight of this confirmation settling on the men's shoulders like snow on pine boughs. "There's something else," she continued, surprising herself with her boldness. "The survivors. We spoke of making a stand, of finding somewhere to fight back instead of just running. Your lands, Jarl, they represent hope to people who have none. If word spreads that you're gathering strength to resist Jarl, we'll have desperate farmers instead of trained warriors," one of the younger men interrupted. "Mouths to feed and backs to protect. We'll have people fighting for their homes instead of just following orders." Astrid shot back, then immediately flushed at her tone. "Forgive me. I speak out of turn." Ragnar raised a hand to forestall any rebuke. "You speak from experience, which is worth more than politeness." He stood, pacing to the great hearth where firelight painted shadows across his weathered features. "The question is whether we have time to turn refugees into fighters." Outside, a horn sounded 3 long, mournful notes, the signal for riders approaching fast. Every man in the hall tensed, hands moving instinctively toward weapons. The heavy doors burst open, and a young scout stumbled inside, ice crystals clinging to his beard and exhaustion written across his face. "Jarl," he gasped, struggling for breath. "Ships, dozens of them, flying Jarl's banner. They've entered the fjord." The great hall buzzed with tension as messengers arrived throughout the morning, each bearing worse news than the last. Eric stood at the head of the long oak table, his weathered hands pressed against its surface as he studied the crude map spread before him. Red stones marked enemy positions, too many red stones. "Thorvald's forces have taken the northern passes," reported Gunnar, his most trusted scout. "They're moving faster than we anticipated. 3 days, maybe 4, before they reach our outer settlements." Astrid entered quietly, carrying bowls of hot broth for the men who had ridden hard through the night. Eric noticed how she moved with purpose now, no longer the broken woman he'd found in the snow. Her children followed close behind, young Bjorn carrying bread, little Sigrid offering dried meat to the warriors. The sight of them serving his men stirred something unexpected in his chest. "What of the southern route?" Eric asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Blocked," came the grim reply. "They've positioned ships along the fjord. We're surrounded on 3 sides." Magnus, Eric's brother-in-arms since childhood, slammed his fist on the table. "Then we fight them head-on. Better to die with sword in hand than cower behind these walls." "And accomplish what?" Eric's voice carried the weight of leadership. "Thorvald has twice our numbers. A direct assault would be slaughter." The hall fell silent, except for the crackling of the central fire. Eric watched his men's faces, seeing doubt creep into eyes that had never known defeat. These were warriors who had sailed with him to distant shores, who had stood shield to shield against impossible odds. Now they looked to him for answers he didn't possess. Astrid approached the table, setting down a steaming bowl near his elbow. She hesitated, then spoke quietly. "May I see the map, my lord?" Several men shifted uncomfortably. It was unusual for a woman to involve herself in matters of war, especially one who had so recently been a stranger. But Eric gestured for her to come closer. She studied the positions marked in red, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This pass here," she said, pointing to a narrow gap between 2 mountain peaks. "It's marked as impassable." "Aye," Magnus confirmed. "Too steep, too treacherous. No army could move through there." "No army," Astrid agreed. "But I know that path. My husband and I. Before he died, we hunted in those mountains. There's an old herder's trail that winds through the peaks. Difficult, yes, but not impossible for a small, determined group." Eric leaned forward, studying where she pointed. "You're suggesting we abandon our stronghold?" "I'm suggesting we use what they don't expect." Her voice grew stronger, more confident. "Thorvald surrounds you because he knows you're here. But what if you weren't? What if his forces found empty halls and cold hearths? And then what?" Gunnar asked skeptically. "We freeze in the mountains while he claims our lands." Astrid's eyes met Eric's. "Then you become what he least expects, not the prey but the hunter." Understanding dawned in Eric's mind like sunrise after the longest night. "We circle behind them, strike at their supply lines, their reinforcements." "More than that," she continued, "I know these lands better than any of Thorvald's scouts. There are places to hide, ways to move unseen. You could harry his forces for weeks, maybe months, make him fight the land itself." Magnus looked incredulous. "You want us to abandon everything we've built on the word of a woman we found dying in the snow?" Eric's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt, a warning in his eyes. But Astrid stepped forward herself, meeting Magnus's gaze directly. "I want you to survive," she said simply. "My children have known nothing but loss and hunger. This man, your Jarl, gave us life when death was certain. If I can help preserve what he's built, then perhaps my family's suffering will have meaning." The hall remained silent as Eric weighed her words. Through the narrow windows he could see snow beginning to fall again, thick flakes that would cover tracks and muffle sounds. Perfect weather for what she proposed. "The risk is enormous," he said finally. "The risk of staying is greater," she replied. Eric studied the map again, seeing it now through her eyes, not as barriers and obstacles, but as opportunities and advantages. His kingdom wasn't just buildings and walls, it was the people who called this land home. If he could preserve them, the rest could be rebuilt. "How many could navigate this path?" he asked. 50 men, perhaps 60 if they're hardy. More would be too many, too visible, too slow. Around the table, his advisors exchanged uncertain glances. Everything in their warrior tradition spoke against retreat, against trusting their fate to mountain paths and guerrilla tactics. Yet Eric saw something else in Astrid's plan, not cowardice, but a different kind of courage. "Prepare the men," he commanded. "We leave at nightfall." The snow had stopped falling, but the cold remained merciless as Bjorn's warband pressed deeper into enemy territory. 3 days had passed since they'd left the village, and the silence from his scouts troubled him more than any war cry could have. The Danish army had vanished like smoke, leaving only trampled earth and cold fire pits to mark their passage. Astrid rode beside him, her small frame bundled in furs that made her look even younger than her 14 winters. Yet her eyes held a sharpness that reminded him daily why he'd chosen her as his counselor. She studied the abandoned campsites with the same intensity she once brought to begging for scraps. "They're not retreating," she said, her breath forming white clouds in the bitter air. "Look at how they broke camp. No haste, no disorder. This is planned." Bjorn nodded grimly. He'd reached the same conclusion, though hearing it from her lips made the truth no less bitter. "They want us to follow. Into what kind of trap, I wonder?" She pulled her horse closer to his. "Father, what do you know of the terrain ahead?" The word father still caught him off guard sometimes, not because he regretted claiming her and her siblings, but because of how naturally it had come to fit. Magnus rode with the rear guard, his sword arm growing stronger each day under Olaf's tutelage. Little Freya remained safe in the hall with the other children and the elderly, though she'd wept fierce tears when told she couldn't accompany them to war. "There's a valley," Bjorn said, pointing toward the low mountains ahead. "Narrow, with high walls. In summer, it runs thick with a river that could drown a horse. Now it will be frozen solid. A killing ground." Astrid's voice carried no fear, only calculation. "They mean to funnel us through it. Perhaps. Or perhaps they think we're too proud to see the obvious trap." He raised his hand, signaling the column to halt. The sound of hooves and mail ceased, leaving only the whisper of wind through bare trees. Olaf rode up from the van, his weathered face grim. "The tracks split ahead, my lord. Half their force continues toward the valley. The other half—" he gestured toward the eastern ridges. "They're moving to high ground." Astrid studied the landscape with calculating eyes. "How many warriors do we have?" 200, Bjorn replied. "Good men, but the Danes outnumber us 3-1. Then we can't fight them as they expect." She dismounted and knelt in the snow, using her dagger to sketch a rough map in the white powder. "Show me the valley." Bjorn climbed down beside her, ignoring the curious stares of his men. Let them wonder why their Jarl took counsel from a slip of a girl. He'd learned to trust her mind in the months since bringing her into his hall. She saw patterns others missed, connections that escaped even his most experienced warriors. "Here," he said, tracing the valley's outline with his finger. "The walls rise steep on both sides. The only way through is straight down the middle. And the river, beneath the ice, deep enough to swallow a man in full mail if the ice breaks." Astrid's eyes lit with sudden understanding. "That's it. That's their mistake." She looked up at him, excitement making her voice rise. "They think like warriors, not like people who've starved through 3 winters. What do you mean?" "The ice, father. They see it as solid ground for their trap, but ice is just frozen water, and water always knows the weakest places to flow." She stood, brushing snow from her knees. "You said half their force went to the high ground?" "Aye. They mean to rain arrows down on us while we're trapped in the valley. But what if we weren't the ones trapped?" Bjorn felt understanding dawn like sunrise after a long night. "You think we can break the ice?" "Not break it, guide it." She gestured toward the mountains. "There will be places where the freeze holds weakly, pressure points. If we could find them—" Olaf had been listening, and now he stepped forward. "Begging your pardon, lady, but ice thick enough to hold an army won't crack easily." "It will, if it's already under strain." Astrid's smile held a wolf's hunger. "And if we help it, along with fire and steel in the right places." Bjorn studied the terrain with new eyes, seeing not a trap but an opportunity. It was dangerous, perhaps mad, but boldness had served him well before. "What do you need?" 20 men who know ice and water, hunters, fishermen, Anyone who understands how rivers behave." She paused, then added, "And time to study the valley before the battle comes to us." The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of distant horns. The Danes were moving, confident in their superior numbers and chosen ground. They had no way of knowing that their trap might become their tomb, or that a starving girl's desperate knowledge might turn the tide of kingdoms. Bjorn felt the familiar weight of command settle on his shoulders, but this time it came paired with something new, pride in the daughter who'd shown him another way to win. The great hall fell silent as Astrid stepped forward, her weathered hands clasping the ancient runestone that had belonged to her grandmother. The firelight danced across the carved symbols, casting shadows that seemed to writhe with prophetic meaning. Magnus watched from his throne, feeling the weight of every eye in the room upon them both. "The signs have been growing stronger," Astrid began, her voice carrying the authority of decades spent reading the will of the gods. "The ravens speak of change coming on wings of iron. The very stones beneath Ironhold whisper of choices that will echo through generations." Bjorn shifted uncomfortably beside his father's throne. Since returning from the southern raids with troubling news of Olaf's growing alliance, he had sensed the tension building like storm clouds on the horizon. The modest success of their recent trading ventures seemed insignificant compared to the looming threat. "Speak plainly, old woman," called out Thorvald from among the gathered warriors. "We are fighters, not riddlers." Astrid's pale eyes fixed on him with such intensity that he involuntarily stepped back. "The gods care nothing for our preferences, Thorvald Ironarm. They speak in symbols because truth is too vast for simple words." She turned back to Magnus, her expression grave. "But I will tell you what the stones have shown me. A choice approaches that will define not just your rule, but the very soul of our people." Magnus leaned forward, his scarred hands gripping the arms of his throne. "What choice?" "Three paths stretch before Ironhold. The first is the way of the old wolf. Strike fast and hard, meet Olaf's threat with overwhelming force. This path leads to glory for some, but the stones show only ash and empty halls at its end." Murmurs rippled through the hall. Many of the warriors nodded grimly, recognizing the truth in her words even as they bristled at the implication. "The second path is the way of the merchant. Buy peace with gold and gifts, trade territory for time. This road leads to slow surrender, a death by 1,000 small compromises until nothing remains of what made us strong." Bjorn exchanged glances with Eric, who had grown increasingly vocal about the need for diplomacy. Both men understood they walked a knife's edge between survival and capitulation. "And the third path?" Magnus asked, though something in his chest already knew the answer would challenge everything he believed about leadership and strength. Astrid smiled then, the first warmth she had shown since entering the hall. "The third path is the one you began walking the day you chose mercy over judgment in the frozen waste. It is the path of the shepherd king, who protects not through fear but through wisdom, who builds strength not by breaking others but by lifting them up." The hall erupted in debate. Warriors shouted over each other, some dismissing Astrid's words as the ramblings of an old woman, others arguing fiercely for the wisdom of the old ways. Through it all, Magnus sat in contemplative silence, his mind turning over recent events like stones in his palm. He thought of Era and her children, now thriving in the settlement below. Young Sven had shown remarkable aptitude with the blacksmith, while little Freya charmed everyone she met with her quick wit and fearless spirit. Their mother had proven invaluable in organizing the women's work, bringing efficiency and cooperation where there had once been rivalry and waste. More importantly, their integration had sparked something unexpected throughout Ironhold. Other families had begun taking in orphans from recent conflicts. Trading partnerships had grown more generous, more focused on mutual benefit than exploitation. The changes were subtle but undeniable. His people were becoming something more than mere raiders and warriors. "You ask us to show our throat to the wolf," Thorvald protested, his voice rising above the din. "Olaf will see mercy as weakness. He will fall upon us like a winter storm." "Perhaps," Astrid replied calmly. "But consider this. What if the very thing he expects to be our weakness becomes our greatest strength? What if the Shepherd King commands loyalties that no amount of fear could inspire?" Magnus stood slowly, and the hall fell silent once more. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "I have spent 30 years believing that strength meant being the fiercest wolf in the pack. But wolves, for all their power, are still just beasts scraping for scraps in the wilderness." He walked to the great window that looked out over his domain, where torchlights twinkled like earth-bound stars. "A shepherd, however, builds something that endures, creates abundance where there was scarcity, turns strangers into allies, not through conquest, but through common cause." Turning back to face his people, Magnus made his choice. "We will not cower before Olaf's threats, nor will we strike first like cornered animals. Instead, we will show him and all the northern kingdoms what true strength looks like. We will build alliances based on respect rather than fear. And when the test comes, we will stand not as lone wolves, but as part of something greater than ourselves." The die was cast, though none could yet foresee where it would land. The war council chamber fell silent as Astrid finished recounting the enemy's movements. Maps spread across the oak table showed red markers where Grimjaw's forces had been spotted, far more numerous than anyone had anticipated. Eric studied the positions, his weathered hands tracing the coastal routes where longships could land. 300 warriors, maybe more," Magnus said grimly. "And those are just the ones we've seen. There could be twice that number hiding in the fjords to the north." Astrid nodded, her face pale but determined. "The scouts from my village confirmed it. Grimjaw isn't just raiding. He's planning to take and hold the territory. He's brought tools for building fortifications, supplies for a long siege." Bjorn leaned back in his chair, the implications settling over him like a heavy cloak. His own forces numbered barely 150 fighting men, and many of those were farmers and fishermen who'd taken up arms to defend their homes. Against professional raiders like Grimjaw's crew, they would be slaughtered. "There's something else," Astrid continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Before I escaped, I overheard Grimjaw speaking with his lieutenants. He knows about the children, about what happened in the forest." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Eric's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt. "What exactly did he say?" "That the Jarl has grown soft, that showing mercy to starving refugees proves his weakness. Grimjaw believes your own people will turn against you when they see you can't protect them." Magnus slammed his fist on the table. "Let him come then. We'll show him what soft means when it's carved into his skull." But Bjorn remained silent, his mind racing through possibilities. Grimjaw wasn't entirely wrong. Mercy was often seen as weakness in their world. Yet those children sleeping safely in the hall tonight represented something more valuable than martial strength. They represented hope, the possibility that their people could be more than just raiders and killers. "We can't meet them in open battle," he said finally. "Not with those numbers. But we have advantages they don't." "Such as?" Eric asked. "We know this land. Every fjord, every hidden passage, every place where a small force could make a stand." Bjorn stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the village below. Smoke rose from a dozen hearths, families gathering for their evening meals. "And we're fighting for our homes. They're fighting for plunder." Astrid stepped closer to the table. "There's more you should know. Grimjaw has allies, jarls from the southern territories who've promised him support if he can establish a foothold here. This isn't just about one village or even one region. If he succeeds, it could spark a war that consumes everything." The weight of that revelation settled over them all. What had begun as protection for a handful of refugees had somehow become a conflict that could determine the fate of their entire kingdom. "The children," Magnus said suddenly. "Maybe we should send them away, get them to safety before—" Bjorn's voice cut through the suggestion with absolute finality. "That's exactly what Grimjaw expects. What he wants. to force us to choose between protecting the innocent and protecting ourselves. He turned back to face the council. But what if we could do both? Over the next hour, they crafted a plan that would have seemed impossible to conventional military thinking. Instead of massing their forces for a traditional defense, they would split into smaller groups, using the treacherous winter landscape to their advantage. The main force would appear to retreat inland, drawing Grimjaw's army away from the coast and into terrain where their superior numbers would matter less. Meanwhile, select teams would harass the enemy supply lines, cut off their retreat routes, and turn the invasion into a grinding war of attrition that would favor the defenders. It was risky. If any part of the plan failed, they would be destroyed piecemeal. As the council dispersed to make preparations, Astrid lingered behind. "You're gambling everything on the belief that your people will follow you into what looks like certain death." Bjorn considered her words carefully. "I'm gambling on the belief that some things are worth dying for. Those children you helped save, they're not just refugees anymore. They're symbols of who we choose to be. And if you're wrong, if Grimjaw wins—" He met her gaze steadily. "Then at least we'll have lost fighting for something meaningful instead of dying as cowards who turned away when mercy was needed." Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, coating the village in pristine white. In 3 days, Grimjaw's forces would arrive, and everything they'd built, everything they believed in, would be tested in the crucible of war. But tonight, children slept safely under his roof, and that alone made the coming battle worthwhile. The great hall fell silent as Bjorn's bloodied messenger collapsed at the base of the high table. His words still echoed in the smoky air. The southern settlements burned, all of them. Astrid felt the weight of every eye upon her as she stepped forward, her children close behind. The months of preparation, the careful alliances she had helped forge, the trust she had built, all of it seemed fragile as spider silk in this moment of crisis. How many survivors? Bjorn's voice was steady, but she could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. "Perhaps 100, the messenger gasped. "They flee north through the woods. King Harald's forces. They showed no mercy, not even to the children." A collective intake of breath swept through the hall. These were not just distant settlements. They were home to many who had kin among Bjorn's people. The political had become deeply personal. Astrid watched as Bjorn's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt. She knew that look. It was the same expression he had worn when she first saw him, when he had chosen mercy over the easier path of indifference. But this time, mercy might not be enough. "My Jarl," called out Thorvald from across the hall, "we cannot let this stand. If we do not respond with force, Harald will see us as weak. He will come for us next." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled warriors. Astrid felt her heart sink. She had seen what war did to communities, how it devoured everything in its path. Her own children bore scars from such violence. "And what would you have us do?" Bjorn asked, his gaze sweeping the room. "March our forces south and leave our own lands undefended? Harald expects us to react with rage. Perhaps that is exactly what he wants." "Then what?" Eric slammed his fist on a nearby table. "We hide behind our walls while our people are slaughtered?" The touch was slight, barely noticeable, but it carried the weight of all their shared experiences. The nights when they had planned together, the moments when her counsel had proven valuable, the gradual building of something that transcended their different origins. Bjorn's eyes met hers, and she saw him truly listening. "There may be another way," she said quietly, her voice somehow carrying despite its softness. "What if we offer sanctuary to all those fleeing Harald's violence? Not just our own people, but anyone seeking refuge." She stepped into the center of the hall, her children following. The firelight caught the determination in her eyes as she addressed the assembly directly, something that would have been unthinkable months ago. "King Harald rules through fear. He burns settlements to send a message, to make people choose between submission and destruction. But what if we offered a third choice? What if we showed that strength can come from protection rather than conquest?" "Pretty words," Eric muttered. but they will not stop Harald's armies. Perhaps not, Bjorn said slowly, his mind clearly working through the implications, but they might make his armies question what they are fighting for. Astrid nodded, encouraged by his understanding. Every person we save is someone who will remember that we chose to protect rather than abandon them. Every family we shelter is a story that will spread. Harald's power comes from making people believe they have no choice but to submit to him. And if he comes here directly, Thorvald demanded, if he brings his full force against our walls, then we fight, Bjorn said simply. But we fight as protectors, not conquerors. We fight defending something worth preserving. The hall erupted in debate, voices raised in argument and discussion. Some saw wisdom in Astrid's proposal, others viewed it as dangerous idealism. But as the arguments swirled around them, Astrid noticed something important. No one was dismissing her words simply because of who she was. The desperate mother who had once begged for scraps was now being heard as a voice of counsel. Young Magnus stepped forward, his voice clear despite his youth. When we were dying in the forest, Jarl Bjorn could have ridden past. It would have been easier, safer, but he did not. The boy's simple words cut through the complex political arguments like a blade through cloth. Here was the living proof of what mercy could accomplish, what kindness could build. Bjorn stood slowly, his decision crystallizing. Send word to all settlements, all travelers. Any who seek refuge from Harald's violence will find sanctuary here. And begin preparations. If we are to house multitudes, we will need supplies, shelters, and plans. As orders began flowing and the hall buzzed with activity, Astrid felt the weight of what they had just set in motion. The war horns echoed across the fjord like the voices of dying gods, their mournful cry reverberating off the ice-covered cliffs. Bjorn stood at the prow of his longship, watching as enemy vessels emerged from the morning mist like phantoms seeking vengeance. Behind him, his warriors gripped their weapons with white knuckles, their breath forming ghostly plumes in the bitter air. 30 ships, Gunnar muttered, his scarred face grim, maybe more hidden in the fog. Bjorn's jaw tightened. Harald the Bloody had brought half his fleet south, more than anyone had anticipated. The reports from their scouts had been wrong, or perhaps Harald had gathered reinforcements from the eastern clans. Either way, they were outnumbered 3-1. My lord, Astrid's voice cut through the tension. She had insisted on coming despite his protests, and now she stood beside him in borrowed mail that hung loose on her slight frame. The children are safely hidden in the mountain caves with half our people. Whatever happens here, they will survive. The children. Bjorn's chest tightened as he thought of Astrid's youngest, barely 6 winters old, clutching a carved wooden bear he had made. Of Eric, now tall enough to reach his shoulder, who had begged to fight alongside them. Of all the families who had sought shelter in his lands over the harsh winter months, drawn by word that Bjorn the Merciful did not turn away those in need. Signal the other ships, he commanded. We make our stand at the Narrows. The next hour blurred into a chaos of splintering wood and ringing steel. The first wave of Harald's ships crashed into their defensive line like a pack of ravenous wolves. Bjorn's blade sang as it carved through shield and bone, his warriors fighting with the desperate fury of men protecting everything they held dear. But for every enemy that fell, 2 more seemed to take their place. The deck beneath Bjorn's feet grew slick with blood, some his own from a glancing blow across his ribs that burned like fire. Around him, good men died with their enemies' names as curses on their lips. The left flank is breaking. Gunnar's roar barely carried over the din of battle. One of their allied ships was listing badly, its crew fighting a losing battle against boarders who swarmed across like ants on honey. Bjorn looked toward the shore, where smoke rose from what had once been a fishing village. Harald's men were already putting settlements to the torch, just as they had promised. The old ways, the way of taking what you wanted and crushing anyone too weak to stop you. A year ago he might have done the same in Harald's position. The thought struck him like a physical blow. My lord, Astrid's warning cry saved his life as an enemy warrior's axe whistled past his ear. Bjorn spun and drove his sword deep into the man's chest, feeling the familiar weight of another death on his soul. How many had he killed? How many widows had he made? How many children left fatherless? The questions that had begun to plague him during the long winter nights now seemed to echo with each swing of his blade. The tide of battle was turning against them. Even his most seasoned warriors were beginning to show signs of exhaustion, their movements growing slower, their formation starting to fragment. In the distance, fresh ships appeared on the horizon, more reinforcements for Harold, or perhaps raiders drawn by the scent of weakness like vultures to carrion. "We need to retreat," Gunnar gasped, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. "Fall back to the secondary positions while we still can." But retreat would mean abandoning the villages on the coast, leaving them to Harold's mercy. Men, women and children who had done nothing wrong except trust in Bjorn's protection. People like Astrid had been when he first found her, desperate, vulnerable, believing that someone might choose kindness over cruelty. "No," Bjorn said, his voice carrying across the deck despite the chaos around them. "We hold the line." Some of his warriors looked at him as if he had gone mad. Perhaps he had, but as he raised his blood-stained sword toward the grey sky, something shifted in the air around them. The men who had served him through countless battles straightened their shoulders and tightened their grips on their weapons. They were no longer fighting for gold or glory or the simple joy of conquest. They were fighting for something greater, for the idea that strength could be used to protect rather than destroy, that mercy was not weakness but the truest form of courage. The enemy's ships pressed closer, their crews howling for blood. But Bjorn's warriors stood firm, a wall of steel and determination against the tide of violence that threatened to wash away everything they had built. In the distance, a raven circled overhead, its black wings cutting through the grey morning light like an omen of what was to come. The great hall of Bjornholm had never seen such tension. Warriors who had faced berserkers without flinching now shifted uneasily as heated voices echoed off the ancient stone walls. Magnus stood at the head of the long table, his weathered hands pressed against the oak surface, watching his most trusted advisors argue like children. "You've doomed us all with your soft heart," Thorstein spat, his scarred face twisted with fury. The old warrior's loyalty had never been questioned, but now doubt crept into his voice like poison. "That woman's children have brought nothing but curse upon our lands." "Curse?" Astrid's voice cut through the hall like a blade. She had grown fierce in the months since Magnus had found her family starving in the snow. "My children have brought you warning of Knut's army. Without Eric's discovery of their scouts, you would have been slaughtered in your beds." Magnus felt the weight of leadership pressing down upon him like a mountain. Through the narrow windows he could see the harbour where their ships bobbed restlessly, as if sensing the approaching storm. 3 days had passed since young Eric had returned with news that changed everything. Prince Knut's forces were not merely raiding, they were coming to conquer, and they numbered in the thousands. "The boy could be mistaken," muttered Olaf, though his voice lacked conviction. The shipwright had always been cautious, but now fear clouded his judgment. "Perhaps we should negotiate, offer tribute." A collective growl rose from the assembled warriors. Even those who questioned Magnus's mercy bristled at the suggestion of bowing to Knut. Bjornholm had never paid tribute to any man, and the idea sat like bile in their throats. "There will be no tribute," Magnus declared, his voice carrying the authority of decades of rule. "We are not sheep to be sheared when wolves grow hungry." Thorstein leaned forward, his knuckles white against the table. "Then we need allies, Jarl. Real allies, not refugees we've sheltered out of pity. The coastal settlements won't stand with us. They're too far away, and Knut's reputation has them cowering." "What of the inland clans?" Astrid asked quietly. The question surprised everyone, including Magnus. In their debate over military strategy, they had overlooked the obvious. Sigurd, who had remained silent throughout the argument, slowly nodded. The grizzled veteran's approval carried weight with the other warriors. The mountain clans have no love for Canute. His raids have cost them dearly over the years. Magnus studied the crude map spread before them, marked with the positions of Canute's forces and their own defences. The numbers were stark and unforgiving. Even with their superior knowledge of the terrain and the loyalty of their people, they were outnumbered 3-1. "What does your son say about their weaknesses?" he asked Astrid suddenly. The question caught her off guard, but she answered without hesitation. Eric saw discipline in their ranks, but also arrogance. They expect easy victory. Their ships are loaded heavy with plunder from other raids, making them slower in the water. "And their leader?" Sigurd pressed. Astrid's expression darkened. "Knut himself leads them." Eric described him as a giant of a man, covered in gold and drunk on his own legend. "He's brought his entire warband, leaving nothing in reserve." Magnus felt a spark of hope kindle in his chest. Arrogance had been the downfall of greater men than Canute. If he's committed everything to this assault, then defeat here means total destruction for him. He cannot afford to retreat. "Neither can we," Thorstein pointed out grimly. "No," Magnus agreed, "but that may work in our favor. Desperate men fight harder than confident ones." The debate continued as shadows lengthened across the hall. Plans were proposed and discarded, strategies debated and refined. Through it all, Magnus found himself watching Astrid and thinking of the choice he had made in the frozen wasteland. Some of his warriors still questioned that decision, but he saw strength in her that they missed. Her children had adapted to their new life with remarkable resilience, and her quiet determination had influenced others in ways both subtle and profound. As the sun set over Bjornholm's walls, Magnus finally called for silence. The assembled leaders turned toward him, their faces reflecting the gravity of their situation. "We will send riders to the mountain clans at first light," he announced. "Not to beg for their aid, but to offer them something they've never had, unity against a common enemy. Meanwhile, we prepare our defenses and wait for Knut to make his move." "And if the clans refuse?" Thorstein asked. Magnus met his old friend's gaze steadily. "Then we make our stand with what we have, and trust that sometimes courage matters more than numbers." The hall fell silent except for the crackling of the great hearth. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, bearing witness to a kingdom balanced on the edge of destiny. The great hall fell silent as Bjorn's blade rang against stone, the metallic echo seeming to hang in the air like a prayer. Harold watched his son, no longer the reckless boy who had once questioned every decision, but a man tempered by loss and hardship. The transformation was complete, forged in the crucible of the past month since they had first encountered Astrid and her children in the snow. "The ships are ready," Magnus announced, his weathered face grim as he entered the hall, "but the ice has thickened. We'll have to break through the harbour mouth." Harold nodded, his mind calculating. The enemy fleet would expect them to be trapped until spring's thaw. It was both their greatest disadvantage and their only hope of surprise. "How many men can we spare from the walls?" "Half," Bjorn said without hesitation. "If we're going to do this, we do it with everything we have." Astrid stepped forward from where she had been standing with the other women, her children close beside her. In the weeks since the siege began, she had become something unexpected, not just a refugee they had saved, but a voice of wisdom that even the most hardened warriors had come to respect. "You speak of taking half your defenders," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "But what of those who remain? What of the people behind these walls?" Harold met her gaze, seeing in her eyes the same steel that had kept her children alive in the wasteland. "They will hold. They must." "No," she said, shaking her head. "You misunderstand me. I'm not questioning your strategy. I'm asking what you need from us, from all of us who cannot swing a sword but can still serve." Young Eric, barely 12 but aged beyond his years by hardship, stepped beside his mother. "I can carry messages, run supplies. I know every passage in these walls now." His sister Ingrid, quiet and observant, added, "The women have been preparing. arrows, bandages, food. We've learned much from watching warriors prepare for battle. Harold felt something shift inside his chest. Pride, perhaps, or something deeper. These people, led by a woman he had found half frozen and dying, were offering to stand with them, not behind them, but alongside them. Deep enough for their largest ships, Magnus answered. Why? She was quiet for a long moment, her finger following the curves of the coastline. When I was young, my father was a fisherman. I know these waters. There's a shoal here. She pointed to a seemingly empty stretch of water that only shows at lowest tide. If your ships could drive them toward it. Harold leaned forward, suddenly understanding. They'd run aground. Some of them, yes. And even if they don't, they'd be forced to navigate carefully, break their formation. Magnus whistled low. That could work. But we'd need to time everything perfectly. The tide, the attack, the positioning. Then we'd better get started, Bjorn said, already moving toward his weapons. Wait. Harold's voice stopped his son at the threshold. There's something else that needs saying. The hall grew quiet again, all eyes turning to the Jarl. Harold looked around at the faces surrounding him, warriors he had led for years, people he had saved on a whim in the snow, children who had become part of his household, his son who had grown into the man Harold had always hoped he might become. Tomorrow, we risk everything, he began. Some of us will not see another sunset. We go into this knowing that our choices tonight may be our last. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Months ago, I made a simple choice. I saw people in need and offered help. I thought it was a small thing, a moment's mercy that would cost little and mean less. His gaze found Astrid, standing proud and unafraid beside her children. I was wrong. That choice changed everything, not because it was grand or heroic, but because it was right. And from that single act of rightness, we built something stronger than any fortress. Bjorn stepped back into the hall, understanding dawning on his face. Tomorrow we fight not just for our lands or our lives, Harold continued. We fight for the idea that mercy is not weakness, that compassion is not folly. We fight to prove that sometimes the smallest choices echo loudest across the ages. The warriors began to disperse, preparing for battle with renewed purpose. Outside, the wind howled against the walls, but inside the great hall, something unbreakable had taken root. The great hall fell silent as Astrid entered, her footsteps echoing against the stone walls like thunder in the mountains. Bjorn rose from his throne, and for a moment the mighty Jarl who had conquered kingdoms looked uncertain, vulnerable even. The woman he had saved from the frozen wasteland 3 winters past now stood before him transformed, no longer the desperate mother clutching starving children, but a shield maiden whose reputation had spread across the northern seas. You received my message, Bjorn said, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken words. Your hall burns while you sit in comfort, Astrid replied, her hand resting on the pommel of her sword. Magnus the Ruthless gathers his forces beyond the eastern ridge. By dawn, he will have us surrounded. Bjorn's advisors shifted nervously. They had underestimated Magnus's cunning, believing their walls would hold through winter. The traitor, who had opened their gates to the first wave of attackers, lay dead, but the damage was done. Magnus now controlled the outer settlements, and his army grew with each victory. Then we fight, declared Eric, Bjorn's eldest son, stepping forward with youthful bravado. We have faced worse odds. Astrid's gaze found the boy. No longer truly a boy, she realized, but a young man who had grown tall and strong under his father's guidance. Beside him stood her own son, Leif, now bearing arms as Bjorn's shield-bearer. The sight of them together, these children who might have died in the snow, reminded her why she had answered Bjorn's call. Magnus doesn't want to simply defeat us, she continued, turning back to Bjorn. He wants to humiliate you. He knows of your mercy. He calls you weak before the other jarls, claims your compassion has made you soft. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Several of Bjorn's men exchanged glances. It was true that their Jarl had changed since that winter day. His justice had become more measured, his raids more strategic and less brutal. Some whispered that saving Astrid and her children had somehow diminished his fearsome reputation. "Let them whisper," Bjorn said firmly. "A king's strength isn't measured only in blood spilled." "Tell that to Magnus when he displays your head on a pike," spat Ulf, one of Bjorn's longtime warriors. "We should have crushed him months ago when we had the chance." Astrid stepped closer to the throne, her voice cutting through the growing murmur of dissent. "You speak of crushing him, yet here he sits at our doorstep. Perhaps it's time for a different strategy." "You would have us negotiate?" Eric scoffed. "Show weakness?" "I would have us survive," Astrid shot back. "Magnus has 800 men. We have perhaps 300 able warriors left. The mathematics of war care nothing for honor." Bjorn studied her face, remembering the fierce determination he had glimpsed that day in the snow when she had refused to let her children die. That same fire burned in her eyes now, but tempered with wisdom earned through hardship. "What do you propose?" he asked. Astrid moved to the great table where maps of the surrounding lands lay spread. "Magnus expects a siege. His men will position themselves here, here, and here," she said, pointing to the high ground surrounding the settlement. "He believes we'll wait behind our walls until hunger or desperation drives us to surrender. Instead, we give him what he wants," she said, her finger tracing a path through the mountains. "You, alone, meeting him in single combat at the sacred stones. But while his attention is focused on you," understanding dawned on Bjorn's face, "the rest of our forces strike from the mountain passes." "Led by your son and mine," Astrid confirmed. "They know those paths better than any of Magnus's men." The hall erupted in protest. The idea of their Jarl facing Magnus alone seemed like madness to most of the warriors. But Bjorn raised his hand for silence, his mind working through the possibilities. "Magnus won't be able to resist," he mused. "The chance to defeat me before witnesses, to claim my lands through trial by combat. It's suicide," Ulf declared. "Magnus is 20 years younger and has never known defeat." "Neither had you once," Astrid said quietly to Bjorn, "until you learned that true victory sometimes requires sacrifice." Their eyes met across the table, and in that moment Bjorn saw not just the warrior she had become, but the mother who had been willing to die for her children. He thought of the choice he had made that winter day, to show mercy when the world expected cruelty, to choose compassion when strength alone would have been easier. "Prepare the men," he commanded. "We move before dawn." As the hall emptied, Astrid lingered beside the throne. "You saved more than just my family that day," she said softly. Bjorn nodded, understanding. Sometimes the greatest battles were won not with swords and shields, but with the choices made in quiet moments when no one was watching. The great hall fell silent as Thorgrim's weathered hands found the iron crown upon his head. The weight of it, which had grown heavier with each passing year, now felt different, not lighter but somehow more purposeful. Around him, the gathered jarls and thanes watched with solemn faces as he lifted the circlet of twisted metal and ancient runes. "A crown is not a gift," he said, his voice carrying across the stone chamber where so many decisions had been made, so many battles planned. "It is a burden willingly accepted by those who would serve their people above themselves." Astrid stepped forward from where she had stood among her children, her back straight despite the years of hardship that had carved lines around her eyes. The woman who had once knelt starving in the snow now moved with the quiet dignity of one who had faced death and found strength in survival. "My lord," she began, but Thorgrim raised his hand. "Not my lord," he said with a slight smile. "From this day forward, it is I who should bow to you." The crown caught the firelight as he extended it toward her, the metal seeming to pulse with the history of countless rulers who had worn it before. "The kingdom needs wisdom born of suffering, compassion forged in hardship. You have walked among both the highest and lowest of our people. You know hunger and plenty, desperation and hope." Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd. but Thorgrim's gaze remained fixed on Astrid. "When I found you in that wasteland, I thought I was saving your life. But you were saving mine, saving all of us. Your children have shown us what true courage looks like, what loyalty means when it springs from love rather than fear." Eric stood tall beside his mother, his hand resting on the sword Thorgrim had given him months ago. The boy had grown into a young man during their time in the Great Hall, his shoulders broadening with training and responsibility. Beside him, little Freydis clutched a wooden doll carved by one of the warriors, her eyes wide as she watched the ceremony unfold. "The raiders came because they saw weakness," Thorgrim continued, his voice growing stronger. "They believed that strength meant only the might of arms, the fear of the sword. But they learned, as we all have learned, that true strength lies in the bonds we forge with one another, in the compassion we show to strangers, in the mercy we extend even when the world grows cold and dark." He thought of the battles they had fought, the alliances forged not through conquest but through the simple act of sharing bread with those who had none. The neighboring clans had come to their aid not because they feared Thorgrim's warriors, but because they respected the kind of leader who would take in refugees, who would care for orphans, who would choose protection over plunder. "I am old," Thorgrim said, and the admission carried no shame, only acceptance. "My sword arm is still strong, but the kingdom needs more than strength now. It needs someone who can see beyond the next raid, beyond the next winter. It needs someone who understands that the greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when we choose who we wish to be." Astrid's hands trembled slightly as they reached for the crown, but her voice remained steady. "I never sought this honor, my lord. I am but a mother who sought to keep her children alive." "And in doing so, you kept all of us alive," he replied. "You reminded us of what we were fighting for, what was worth preserving. A kingdom is not its borders or its treasure, it is its people and the bonds that tie them together." The crown settled upon Astrid's head with surprising naturalness, as if it had always been meant for her. The firelight seemed to dance more brightly in the great hall, and Thorgrim could almost feel the approval of his ancestors, the sense that this choice, like that first moment of mercy in the snow, was right and necessary. "Rise, Queen Astrid," he said formally, then knelt before her along with every other person in the hall. "Rise and lead us into whatever storms may come." As she stood there, crowned and surrounded by those who had become her family, Astrid thought of the road that had brought them to this moment. Every frozen step, every desperate prayer, every small act of kindness had led to this. She thought of her husband, fallen in battle far from home, and knew he would have been proud to see his children safe and honored in this great hall. The kingdom stretched out beyond the walls, vast and sometimes harsh, but filled with people who now understood that their greatest strength lay not in their ability to take, but in their willingness to give. And in the warm glow of the firelight, surrounded by the laughter of children and the steady presence of those who had chosen compassion over cruelty, the future seemed bright with possibility.